Hi, so in this video we are to finalize Krugman's model with two regions and two factors of production, and as you remember last time we finished here. So the idea was that let's say relative attractiveness of the region for the labor force would depend on the wage as well as price level. So they were calculated as follows as the functions of F, and F standard for the share of manufacturing labor force located in the region 1 out of total manufacturing labor force located in two regions. Okay, so the idea was like this. On one hand, price level in the region with the higher stock of the labor force would be smaller due to the economies of scale. So if there is higher level of production, then per unit average cost would decrease, and subsequently there would be smaller price level. On the other hand, in bigger regions, labor force faces higher degree of rivalry, and this might be some factor which would discourage movement from a smaller region to the bigger region, or I mean from the region with smaller stock of the labor force to the region with the bigger stock of the labor force. So real wage was calculated as follows as the product of nominal wage, W1 and W2 for the first and the second region respectively, and price level taken to the power of negative mu. So here again the idea is that in the bigger region there is smaller number of products imported from the other region and bigger number of products which are consumed and produced domestically. So subsequently this is to affect the nominal wage and the share of expenditure which is wasted due to the transportation costs. And as you remember, tau was inserted to this model in order to define the proportion of product which arrives to the other region. So this is not the cost, this is something inverted to the cost. So basically it means that if we have bigger value of tau, it means that higher proportion of goods arrives to the other region, and this describes smaller transportation costs. Let's say this reflects smaller transportation costs. Like, of course, transportation cost is some kind of the general name for transaction costs. So the idea is that some share of the product value can be lost in the process of transportation, but in this case you can also think not only about the costs of transportation, but transaction costs in general. So for instance, I don't know, some costs of arranging the export, some costs associated with tariffs, and so on and so forth. So as I said, in this model you can safely discuss transaction costs in general instead of concentrating on pure transportation costs, at least when you analyze the value and the effect of tau. And we ended up here. So the idea is like this. When deciding about their reallocation to the other region, or like if we assume for a second that labor force is immobile when deciding on the relative income, we have to take into account not nominal wages but the real wages. And the ratio of real wages can be calculated as follows. So again, it was a kind of additional assignment to analyze the relationship between real wages and variable f, or vice versa, how the value of f variable would affect the ratio of real wages depending on the level of transportation costs. By the way, no one submitted this yet, so the assignment is still valid. If you'd like to get some additional points, you can prove, or you can just explore the relationship between wages and share of manufacturing labor force located in the first region, depending on the value of transportation costs. And here you can see the solution presented by Krugman. So in order to design this graph, in the original paper we discussed, he assumes the value of sigma equal to 4, a value of mu equal to 0.3 or 0.4, I'm not sure, and he introduced different assumptions regarding the value of tau. So if tau is equal to 0.75, which reflects low transportation costs or low transaction cost, because 75% describes the proportion of product which arrives to the region of destination, then the ratio of wages will increase as concentration of manufacturing labor force in the first region increases. In other words, workers in the bigger regions will get higher real wage in comparison to workers in the smaller regions. And if we assume that transportation costs are high, so the value of tau is equal to 0.5, for instance, then the direction of this relationship will be the opposite. So workers in the bigger regions will get smaller wages in comparison to workers in the smaller regions. So here basically everything, depends on the assumption about transportation cost. But even at this point, we can conclude that low transportation costs will facilitate concentration of production and labor force in one of the regions. So the same, very similar analysis can be conducted using, other research strategy. And here we analyze necessary condition for income concentration. So based on what we discussed before, the relative income in two regions, or the ratio of income in region 2 to the income in region 1, can be calculated as the ratio of 1 minus mu, labor force in the second region, total force in the second region, to 1 plus mu, the stock of labor force in the first region. So in this case, we can calculate value generated by the first firm or revenue of the first firm based on the following formula. And analogously, the ratio of wages will be described as, let's put it in a different way. So the ratio of wage in the second region, nominal wage, to the nominal wage in the first region will be calculated as 1 over tau to the power of mu. So in this case, we analyze whether it makes any sense for the firm located in one of the regions to move to the other region. So here we assume that the firm is located in the first region, and V2 would be the value generated by the respective firm if it reallocates to the second region. So in this case, we will be interested in the ratio of values generated in two regions, which will be described by small v. So here we have it. Again, you can just obtain this value by dividing value generated in the second region by the value generated in the first region, and you will obtain this expression. So finally, if we are interested how the ratio of values generated in the second and the first region will be affected by the concentration of manufacturing labor force in the first region, you will have to calculate the derivative of the value with respect to mu, and you will see it's negative. So the idea is like this: the firms are able to generate higher value by locating in the regions with the higher stock of the labor force. So this implies that regions with the higher stock of the labor force will attract more producers. So from this model, of course, like as usual, you do not have to know how to derive this. You just have to know the key insights in order to be able to pass the final exam. So key insights are as follows. In conventional models, where we assume perfectly immobile factors of production, transaction costs discourage trade. In new trade theory and new economic geography, high transaction costs facilitate. Okay, probably divergence will not be the most appropriate way because usually you analyze it in terms of income divergence. So let's put it in a different way. High transaction costs imply the disadvantage for the labor force located in the bigger regions, and that's why labor force is expected to move from big to small regions under high transaction costs, and vice versa. If transaction costs are relatively low, it will imply the advantage for the labor force located in the bigger regions. That's why under low transaction costs, labor force will move from small to bigger regions. Also, firms located in the regions with higher concentration of workers generate greater value. So we can conclude that assuming low transaction costs, regions with higher concentration of manufacturing labor force will attract more firms and more labor force. Okay, so just to make some conclusion about, core periphery model, as it's called, because this is exactly what we analyze. We will expect that some regions will become core regions and some regions will remain on the periphery. So just to make some generalized conclusions, in new economic geography, we distinguish between centripetal and centrifugal forces. So centripetal forces are the forces which encourage movement of labor force and firms to the core regions. So in this case, of course, we have pure external economies of scale. And again, it was not discussed before because there was no particular reason for this. But actually, in this kind of model, we distinguish between external economies of scale and internal economies of scale. So internal economies of scale are related to the volume of production generated by the single firm, and we assume that if a single firm produces more units of output, the average cost per unit decreases. But when it comes to external economies of scale, we analyze the entire industry. So under external economies of scale, each firm constituting the industrial cluster will benefit from the bigger production of this cluster. And like the classical example is Silicon Valley, when there is high concentration of the firms working exactly in the same sector, and they benefit because of specialized suppliers, high pool, like big pool of educated labor force, and so on and so forth. So basically what I mean is that it makes sense for them to be located next to each other because of the external economies of scale. But I believe that this is pretty straightforward, yes. If you benefit from producing within the large industry, then probably you will like to locate next to the big industrial cluster. Thick labor markets, so as we discussed before, if there is a high stock of the labor force, then the region will be relatively attractive for laborers and firms. And finally, market size effects or linkages. So this is something very similar to the specialized suppliers I mentioned before. So the idea is like this: if you are located within the large industrial cluster, then it's easier for you to establish like business relations, let's say, with specialized suppliers, and all the firms within the cluster will benefit from this. At the same time, centrifugal forces, or forces which discourage regional concentration, are immobile factors of production, land rents, and pure external diseconomies. And again, I believe it's kind of intuitive because immobility of factors will deteriorate the entire analysis presented before. So under immobile factors, we are closer to the world of conventional models of international trade, and pure external diseconomies occur when firms located in the large production clusters generate less value in comparison to like stand-alone firms. So in this case, under pure diseconomies, the more units the entire industry produces, the bigger the average per unit cost is. So obviously, in this case, concentration makes no sense. So here you can see some evidence from the European Union, because, if we concentrate on the key insights derived from the model we discussed, then actually it implies that if we have some initial regional discrepancy, like one region is bigger, it has more manufacturing labor force, probably higher level of income, although this is not assumed in the initial theoretical model, and there are extremely low transaction costs, like probably good transportation roads, no tariffs, or transaction costs in general, then we expect that, oh, of course, and if we assume that labor force is perfectly mobile, at this point I would like you to pay attention to the fact that these assumptions are very similar to what we observe in the European Union. So if all of these assumptions are fulfilled, then actually there will be a tendency for the labor force and firms to locate in the big regions, like increasing this initial regional discrepancy. And actually this is something we can observe in the European Union. So here you can see statistics on passenger traffic in EU airports expressed in millions of passengers. So again, you can see that core regions tend to attract even more and more passengers, and let's say some periphery regions would attract much less passengers. Again, this is not the proof, but this is just some indirect evidence in favor of what I discussed before, and the author of this article presented this data for the similar purpose. Again, you can see very similar statistics when it comes to cargo and mail loaded at EU airports in thousands of tons. So this value tends to increase in the bigger regions in the increasing rate. At the same time, when it comes to the smaller regions, it's smaller, and it will increase slower. Again, when it comes to some more straightforward proof, here we can see data on population density in the European Union. And again, here you have Germany, Belgium, and like other core continental European Union economies. Here you have Eastern region of the European Union, like Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and so on and so forth. And again, in the core region, it's easy to notice that population density is higher. Moreover, you have more agglomerations with extremely high density of population, which again proved the point, if one region is initially, let's say, relatively more developed, it has higher stock of manufacturing labor force, then this discrepancy, like this gap, will be bigger and bigger because this core region will attract more and more firms and the labor force. Analogously, this will be reflected by the value of income. So first of all, you can notice that in the center of European Union, there is higher average level of income, which just proves this point, and it's perfectly in line with what we discussed before. So these regions have more manufacturing labor force, higher initial concentration of business. So these regions will attract more and more firms and the labor force, and the level of income will increase faster in these regions accordingly. So this is the first observation, and the second one is that if you do not analyze European Union in general, but let's say particular regions in particular economies, again you can notice that there is some concentration in the core regions, like capital regions, let's say something like this. So for instance, you can observe the same trend in Poland. Like Warsaw agglomeration is increasing all the time. At the same time, the stock of the labor force in peripheral, whatever regions is decreasing, especially when it comes to high-skilled labor force. So probably, yeah, the last conclusion would be the most valid. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you do not have to know how to derive all the proofs as usual. What you have to know is related to the key insights from this model. So what I mean is the trends when it comes to concentration of business and concentration of high-skilled labor force pool in the regions, and how assumptions we discussed before might facilitate or discourage this trend. Okay, so that was it, and thank you for watching.